April 1942. The Philippine island of Luzon. After 3 months of desperate fighting, 76,000 men, Americans and Filipinos, surrendered to the Japanese Imperial Army. They were starving, diseased, and exhausted. They expected to be treated according to the rules of war. Instead, they were subjected to one of the most brutal atrocities in modern military history. For 5 to 10 days, they were forced to march 65 miles through tropical heat without food, water, or rest. Those who fell were beaten, bayoneted, or beheaded. Thousands died along the roadside. Thousands more died in the hell camps that awaited them. This is the story of the Bataan Death March, 60 miles of horror that stands as one of the darkest chapters of World War II. A story of unspeakable cruelty and unbreakable courage. December 7, 1941. Hours after attacking Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers struck the Philippines. Clark Air Base, north of Manila, was devastated. 18 B-17 flying fortresses, half of America's heavy bomber force in the Pacific, were destroyed on the ground. 56 P-40 fighters were obliterated. In one day, American air power in the Philippines was crippled. 3 days later, on December 10, the main Japanese invasion force, 43,000 troops of the Imperial Japanese 14th Army under General Masaharu Homma, landed at Lingayen Gulf on the northwest coast of Luzon. Facing them, 130,000 troops under General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of United States Army Forces in the Far East. On paper, MacArthur outnumbered the Japanese 3-1. But the reality was different. Most of MacArthur's force consisted of poorly trained, ill-equipped Filipino reservists. Many had never fired a rifle. Some units had 1 rifle for every 5 men. They had no armor, inadequate artillery, and no air support. Against them came veteran Japanese troops, battle-hardened from years of fighting in China, equipped with tanks, modern weapons, and air superiority. The outcome was inevitable. By December 22, MacArthur ordered a retreat. All forces would withdraw to the Bataan Peninsula, a jungle-covered thumb of land 30 miles long and 15 miles wide, jutting into Manila Bay. The plan was called War Plan Orange 3, hold Bataan and the island fortress of Corregidor, deny the Japanese Manila Bay, and wait for reinforcements from America. But MacArthur's withdrawal was catastrophic. He left behind tons of food, ammunition, medical supplies, and fuel. Warehouses full of rice, enough to feed his army for months, were abandoned in Manila. Why? No one knows. Some historians believe MacArthur panicked. Others suggest simple incompetence. Whatever the reason, the result was disaster. By January 6, 1942, 80,000 troops, including 67,000 Filipino soldiers, 12,000 American soldiers, and 26,000 Filipino civilians, were crammed onto Bataan with about 30 days' worth of food. Immediately, MacArthur ordered half rations, then quarter rations. Within weeks, men were starving. The Battle of Bataan had begun. The men on Bataan called it Battling Bastards of Bataan. No Papa, no Mama, no Uncle Sam. They felt abandoned, and they were right. President Roosevelt and Army Chief of Staff George Marshall had written off the Philippines. Europe came first. The Pacific would have to wait. No reinforcements were coming. No supplies. No rescue. MacArthur knew this but didn't tell his men. Instead, he assured them help was on the way. It was a lie. By February 1942, the situation was desperate. Soldiers ate horses, mules, monkeys, snakes, lizards, anything with protein. They boiled tree bark to make soup. Malaria swept through the ranks. Dengue fever. Dysentery. Beriberi caused by vitamin deficiency. Men's gums bled. Their teeth fell out. They went blind from lack of nutrition. Hospital wards overflowed with thousands of sick and dying men. Doctors operated without anesthesia, using alcohol to sterilize instruments. Nurses worked 18-hour shifts, trying to save lives with almost no medicine. And through it all, the Japanese attacked. Artillery bombardments. Infantry assaults. Air raids. The defenders held, barely. They fought from foxholes and spider holes in the jungle. They mounted desperate counterattacks with bayonets when ammunition ran out. Filipino and American soldiers fought side by side, brothers in suffering. But by March, the defense was crumbling. Men were literally starving to death at their positions. March 11, 1942. President Roosevelt ordered General MacArthur to evacuate to Australia. MacArthur, his family, and selected staff boarded PT boats at Corregidor under cover of darkness. As he left, MacArthur made a promise, "I shall return." To the men left behind on Bataan, those words rang hollow. Their commander had abandoned them. MacArthur's escape left Major General Edward P. King in command on Bataan, and Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright in overall command on Corregidor. King was a decent man, West Point class of 1908, career artillery officer. He inherited an impossible situation: 78,000 starving, diseased troops with no hope of relief, facing a Japanese force that was being reinforced daily. King knew there were only two choices: surrender or annihilation. On April 3rd, the Japanese launched their final offensive. Fresh troops, tanks, and artillery smashed into the weakened American-Filipino lines. The defenders, many too weak to even stand, tried to fight. But it was hopeless. April 9, 1942. Good Friday. At 12:30 p.m., General Edward King drove to meet the Japanese under a white flag. He met with Colonel Matsu Nakayama, senior operations officer of the Japanese 14th Army. King offered his sword in surrender, the largest capitulation of American forces in history. 76,000 men became prisoners of war. King begged for his troops to be treated humanely. The Japanese made no promises. What happened next violated every international law of warfare. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment of prisoners, adequate food, water, shelter, medical care. Prisoners were to be transported efficiently to detention camps. The sick and wounded were to be treated. None of this happened. Instead, the Japanese subjected their captives to deliberate torture and mass murder. The question that haunts history is, why? Some historians argue the Japanese were unprepared for so many prisoners. They'd expected 25,000 captives, not 76,000. Others point to Japanese military culture. Surrender was considered the ultimate disgrace, so prisoners deserved no mercy. Still others believe it was calculated terror, a message to all Allied forces that resistance was futile. Whatever the reason, what followed was an atrocity. The Bataan Death March. April 10, 1942. The march began. Japanese guards assembled prisoners into groups of 500 to 1,000 men at various points across southern Bataan. Before they marched, the guards subjected them to what prisoners called the sun treatment. Men were forced to stand at attention in the blazing tropical sun from dawn until midday. No water, no shade, no rest. They'd been fighting for 3 months on starvation rations. They were already dehydrated, malnourished, sick. Now, for 4 to 6 hours, they stood motionless in 100-degree heat with 90% humidity. Men collapsed. Japanese guards beat them with rifle butts until they stood again. If a man couldn't stand, guards bayonet him where he lay. Some were beheaded with samurai swords. This wasn't combat. This was murder. And it was just the beginning. The march route ran north from Mariveles at the southern tip of Bataan, up the east coast road through Cabcaben, Lamao, Limay, Balanga, Orani, Lubao, and finally to San Fernando, roughly 65 miles. From San Fernando, prisoners would be packed into trains to Capas, then forced to march another 7 miles to Camp O'Donnell. For most prisoners, the entire ordeal lasted 5 to 10 days. But for some, it lasted 2 weeks. They were given no information, no idea how far they'd march, where they were going, or what awaited them. They marched in columns of 4, guarded by Japanese soldiers every 50 yards. The guards had orders: keep moving, no stops, no rest, no mercy. Stragglers would be killed. The pace was brutal, 4 to 5 miles per hour under tropical sun. These were men who'd been starving for months, suffering from malaria, dysentery, dengue fever. Many had combat wounds that had never properly healed. They wore whatever remained of their uniforms, shredded, filthy rags. Most had no shoes. Their feet became masses of infected blisters and open sores. Within hours, the roadside was littered with bodies. Prisoners who fell out of line were beaten. If they couldn't get up, they were bayonet or shot. Japanese guards made it a sport. Some used prisoners for bayonet practice. Others beheaded men with swords. The torture was creative and sadistic. Guards would stop the column, force men to dig graves, then execute the gravediggers and throw them in the holes. Water was the cruelest torment. Men were dying of thirst, their tongues swollen black, lips cracked and bleeding. Along the route were artesian wells, freshwater wells where local Filipinos drew water. When the columns passed these wells, prisoners could see the water, hear it, smell it. Desperation overcame reason. Men broke from the columns and ran toward the wells. Japanese guards opened fire. They shot prisoners in the back as they ran. They bayoneted men who reached the wells. Bodies piled up around the water sources. Brave Filipino civilians tried to help. They held out canteens, coconuts filled with water, pieces of fruit. The Japanese shot them too. Entire families were executed for trying to give water to prisoners. One survivor, Lester Tenney, later wrote, "A Filipino woman with a baby held out a cup of water to me. A guard saw her and smashed her baby's head against a rock, then bayoneted her. I kept marching. If I'd stopped, I'd be dead too." This was the systematic destruction of human decency. The Japanese weren't just killing prisoners, they were killing anyone who showed them mercy. The methods of torture were limitless. Guards forced prisoners to sit in the sun for hours without moving. If a man shifted position, he was beaten. Prisoners were buried up to their necks and left in the sun until they died of exposure. Some were tied to trees and used for bayonet practice, slowly stabbed until they bled to death. Others were forced to dig their own graves, then shot and pushed in. Beheading was common. Japanese officers practiced sword techniques on prisoners, sometimes making bets on how many strokes it would take to sever a head. There were instances of crucifixion. Men were tied to posts and left to die slowly. Some were doused with gasoline and burned alive. Guards played games. They'd throw prisoners' personal items, photographs of wives and children, into ditches, then beat the prisoners when they tried to retrieve them. They stole wedding rings, watches, any valuables. Prisoners who resisted were killed immediately. But the worst torture was psychological. The Japanese would select men at random and execute them in front of their comrades. The message was clear: any of you could be next. Witnesses later testified that Japanese guards seemed to enjoy the killing. They laughed while they murdered. They took photographs of themselves posing with corpses. This wasn't the heat of battle. This was sadism. Those who survived to San Fernando faced a new hell. Japanese guards forced 100 men into boxcars designed to hold 40. The prisoners were so tightly packed they couldn't sit or squat, only stand, pressed together. The boxcars were sealed. No ventilation. No windows. The tropical sun turned the cars into ovens. Temperatures inside exceeded 120 degrees. Men suffocated standing up. The air was so foul, filled with the stench of dysentery, vomit, and death, that men passed out from the fumes. When the train stopped at Capas and the doors opened, guards discovered dozens of corpses. Dead men who'd been held upright by the press of bodies. The living had to climb over the dead to get out. One survivor, Sidney Stewart, wrote, "Men were screaming, praying, crying. I felt a man die against me. His body just went limp. But I couldn't move. I was trapped. I thought, this is how I die. Not in battle, but suffocating in a boxcar like cattle." Those who survived the train faced another 7-mile march to Camp O'Donnell. Many collapsed in sight of the camp and were shot. Camp O'Donnell wasn't a prisoner of war camp. It was a death camp. Located in Tarlac Province, it had been a Philippine Army training center before the war, designed to house a few thousand troops temporarily. Now it held 54,000 prisoners in conditions deliberately calculated to kill them. There was one water spigot for the entire camp. Prisoners waited in line for 6 to 8 hours to fill a canteen. Many died in line. Sanitation didn't exist. Latrines overflowed. Disease spread like wildfire: dysentery, malaria, typhoid, dengue fever, diphtheria, beriberi. The camp hospital had no medicine, no beds, no equipment. Doctors could only watch men die. Food was a cup of rice per day, often contaminated with worms and rat feces. Men were walking skeletons, weighing 80 pounds, covered in tropical ulcers, their bodies slowly shutting down. The death rate was staggering. At one point, 400 men per day were dying, Filipino and American. Bodies were stacked like cordwood outside barracks. Burial details couldn't keep up. The Japanese provided no medical care, no additional food, no mercy. Camp Commandant Captain Yoshio Tsuneyoshi made it clear, "You are not prisoners of war. You are captives. You have no rights. You will be worked until you die." And they were. How many died? The exact number will never be known. Japanese records were deliberately destroyed or falsified. But based on survivor testimonies and post-war investigations, historians estimate, during the march itself, 600 to 650 Americans died. Between 5,000 and 10,000 Filipinos died. At Camp O'Donnell in the first 2 months, 1,500 Americans died. 26,000 Filipinos died. In total, approximately 27,000 to 28,000 men died as a direct result of the march and its immediate aftermath, more than 1/3 of all prisoners. But these numbers don't capture the horror. They don't tell the story of men who watched their best friends beaten to death, of sons who died calling for their mothers, of men who survived but were broken forever. The Bataan Death March wasn't just mass murder. It was the systematic destruction of human dignity. Lester Tenney was 22 years old when he surrendered on Bataan. A tank commander with the 192nd Tank Battalion, he weighed 120 pounds when the march began. He weighed 70 pounds when he reached Camp O'Donnell. He survived Bataan. He survived 3.5 years as a slave laborer in Japanese mines. He survived until liberation in 1945. But he never forgot. In his memoir, My Hitch in Hell, Tenney wrote, "I saw men beaten to death for asking for water. I saw a Japanese guard take a baby from a Filipino mother and bash its head against a rock because she tried to give us food. I saw American soldiers beheaded with samurai swords. I saw things that no human being should ever see. And for decades, I carried that with me. The nightmares. The guilt for surviving when so many didn't. The anger at a government that left us to die and then wanted us to forget." Tenney spent the rest of his life ensuring the world wouldn't forget. He testified at war crimes trials. He wrote books. He gave hundreds of interviews. Until his death in 2017 at age 96, he was one of the last living witnesses to the Bataan Death March. His testimony, and that of thousands like him, is why we know what happened. Why we remember. Paul Kircham was 21 when he marched. He survived by drinking from muddy puddles and eating insects. He watched Japanese guards bury prisoners alive. He saw men crucified. After the war, Kircham struggled with hatred. He wanted revenge on every Japanese person he met. But decades later, he made a choice. He chose to forgive. Not to forget. Never to forget. But to forgive. "I realized the hatred was killing me," he said in a 2017 interview. "Not them. Me. So I let it go. I forgave the guards. I forgave the Japanese people. But I will never stop telling the world what they did to us. Because if we forget, it will happen again." Kircham lived to age 102. Until his final years, he walked in memorial marches honoring the dead of Bataan. He forgave his torturers. But he never stopped bearing witness. The Bataan Death March is often remembered as an American tragedy. But Filipinos suffered disproportionately. Of the 76,000 prisoners who surrendered, 66,000 were Filipinos, 87%. Of those who died on the march and in Camp O'Donnell, more than 90% were Filipinos. Why? Racism. The Japanese considered Filipinos racially inferior, colonial subjects who betrayed their Asian brothers by fighting for white colonizers. Filipino prisoners received even less food than Americans. They were beaten more severely. They were executed more readily. But Filipino suffering extended beyond the prisoners. Thousands of Filipino civilians were murdered for trying to help. Families who gave water to prisoners were executed. Villages suspected of harboring escaped POWs were burned, their inhabitants massacred. The Japanese occupation of the Philippines would last 3 years. During that time, an estimated 1 million Filipino civilians died, from starvation, disease, execution, and collateral damage. The Philippines paid the highest price in the Pacific War outside of China. Yet their sacrifice is often overlooked. The Philippine scouts who fought on Bataan were among the finest soldiers in the Pacific. They held the line for 99 days against overwhelming odds. They deserved better than they got, from the Japanese, and from history. After the war, the perpetrators faced justice. General Masaharu Homma, commander of Japanese forces in the Philippines, was tried by an American military tribunal in Manila in 1946. Prosecutors charged him with command responsibility for the Bataan Death March and other atrocities. Homma claimed he knew nothing about the march, that subordinates had acted without his knowledge. Few believed him. Survivors testified. They described the beatings, the executions, the deliberate torture. They identified specific guards who'd committed murders. The tribunal found Homma guilty. On April 3, 1946, 4 years to the day after he'd launched the final assault on Bataan, Homma was executed by firing squad outside Manila. His last words, "I have done my duty as a soldier." Other officers were tried and executed. Some escaped justice. Many low-ranking guards were never identified or prosecuted. But the trials established precedent. Commanding officers are responsible for war crimes committed by troops under their command. The Bataan Death March trials helped lay the groundwork for modern international humanitarian law. October 20, 1944. General Douglas MacArthur waded ashore at Leyte, fulfilling his promise, "I have returned." The liberation of the Philippines had begun. For the prisoners still alive, scattered across camps throughout the Philippines and Japan, liberation couldn't come soon enough. By 1945, of the 12,000 Americans captured on Bataan, fewer than 4,000 remained alive. They'd survived nearly 3 years of starvation, beatings, disease, and slave labor. On January 30, 1945, the 1st Cavalry Division liberated Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila, freeing 3,700 civilian internees and POWs. On February 3, elements of the 1st Cavalry reached Bilibid Prison and freed 1,300 military POWs. On February 23, the 11th Airborne Division liberated Los Baños internment camp in a daring raid, rescuing 2,147 prisoners hours before Japanese guards planned to execute them all. But many POWs never saw liberation. As American forces advanced, the Japanese executed prisoners wholesale. They packed some into ships, hell ships, transporting them to Japan for slave labor. Many of these ships were sunk by American submarines or bombers who didn't know POWs were aboard. Others were worked to death in Japanese mines and factories. Of the roughly 27,000 Americans captured in the Philippines, approximately 40% died in captivity. The survival rate for American POWs in German camps was 96%. In Japanese camps, 60%. The difference speaks volumes. When the survivors came home, America didn't know what to do with them. These men looked like walking corpses, skeletal, scarred, traumatized. Many weighed less than 100 pounds. They suffered from malaria, tuberculosis, dysentery, and tropical diseases doctors had never seen. Psychologically, they were shattered. They had nightmares. They couldn't talk about what they'd experienced. Post-traumatic stress disorder, called shell shock or battle fatigue then, consumed many. Some never recovered. They couldn't hold jobs, couldn't maintain relationships, couldn't escape the memories. And for decades, America tried to forget. The Bataan Death March was too ugly, too shameful. How could America have let it happen? How could 76,000 men be abandoned and left to die? It was easier not to ask. The government kept information classified. Survivors were discouraged from speaking publicly. The official history minimized the atrocities. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s, when aging survivors began telling their stories, that America confronted the full horror of Bataan. By then, most of the perpetrators were dead. Most of the witnesses were dying. But at last, the truth was told. In 1989, a tradition began at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. The Bataan Memorial Death March, a 26.2-mile marathon through the desert to honor the victims and survivors of the original march. Thousands participate annually: active-duty military, veterans, civilians, students. They carry rucksacks weighing up to 35 pounds. They endure heat, thirst, and exhaustion, a small taste of what the prisoners suffered. 4 decades, survivors attended. They walked alongside the marchers, sharing their stories, ensuring the world wouldn't forget. Lester Tenney walked the Memorial March into his 90s. Ben Scardon walked it until he was 98 years old, the last survivor able to do so. They walked not for recognition, but for their comrades who died on the road. As Scardon said in a 2015 interview, "Every step I take is for a man who couldn't finish the march. Every step honors a friend who died so I could live. I march so they're remembered." The survivors are gone now. The last Bataan Death March survivor, Ben Scardon, died in 2020 at age 98. But the Memorial March continues. And the story is passed down. In the Philippines, the memory of Bataan remains powerful. Memorials stand at key points along the march route. Museums preserve artifacts and testimonies. April 9th, Araw ng Kagitingan, Day of Valor, is a national holiday honoring the Filipino and American soldiers who fought and died. For Filipinos, Bataan represents both tragedy and pride. Tragedy for the tens of thousands who died. Pride that Filipino soldiers fought alongside Americans as equals, held the line for 99 days, and suffered the same horrors. The Filipino veterans of Bataan fought for decades for recognition and benefits from the United States. Many never received them. The promise of full veterans' benefits for Filipino soldiers who served under the American flag was broken after the war. It wasn't until 2009, nearly 70 years later, that Congress partially restored benefits. By then, most Filipino veterans of Bataan were dead. The injustice remains. But the memory persists. Filipino families pass down stories of grandfathers and great-grandfathers who marched. Who survived? Who died? The Philippines has not forgotten. What did Bataan teach us? First, the Geneva Conventions exist for a reason. Prisoners of war must be treated humanely. Commanders are responsible for their troops' conduct. War crimes will be prosecuted. The post-war trials established these principles in international law. Second, never abandon your troops. The Philippines campaign was marked by broken promises and failed leadership. MacArthur's retreat to Australia while his men starved. Washington's decision to write off the Philippines. The lies that help was coming when everyone knew it wasn't. These failures haunted American military culture for generations. Modern doctrine emphasizes, leave no man behind. Third, racism kills. Japanese attitudes toward Asians they considered inferior, Chinese, Koreans, Filipinos, led to atrocities throughout the Pacific. Dehumanization always precedes genocide. When soldiers stop seeing enemies as human, evil becomes possible. Fourth, individual courage matters. The prisoners who survived did so through mutual support. They shared food when they had none. They carried wounded comrades. They maintained discipline and dignity in hell. They proved that even in the worst atrocity, humanity can endure. And finally, memory matters. For decades, survivors fought to ensure the Bataan Death March wouldn't be forgotten. They testified. They wrote books. They gave interviews. They walked memorial marches. Why? Because forgetting enables repetition. If we don't remember Bataan, we risk allowing it to happen again. The last survivors are gone now. Lester Tenney died in 2017. Paul Kircham in 2020. Ben Scardon in 2020. One by one, the living witnesses passed into history. With them died the direct link to April 1942. No longer can we hear first-hand accounts from men who marched. No longer can we ask questions, seek clarifications, understand details only they knew. We're left with their testimonies, their books, their recorded interviews. We're left with photographs and documents. We're left with memorials and museums. And we're left with responsibility, the responsibility to remember, to tell their story, to ensure that the 27,000 men who died on that road are not forgotten, to honor the 76,000 who surrendered on Good Friday and faced hell. The Bataan Death March. 60 miles of horror. 76,000 prisoners. 27,000 dead. One of the worst atrocities of World War II. A crime against humanity. and a testament to the courage of men who endured the unendurable. We will never forget them. We will never forget what they suffered. We will never forget what they taught us about cruelty and about courage. Lest we forget. If this video helped you understand history a little deeper, or made you see these moments in a new way, make sure to leave a like. It truly supports the channel and helps bring more such stories to life. Share your thoughts in the comments. Which moment impacted you the most? Or what historical event would you like me to cover next? Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss future videos on history, war stories, and untold events that shaped our world. Thank you for watching till the end. Remember, history is not just about the past, it's a lesson for the future. See you in the next video.